Hello everyone, this is part 11 of What If Naruto Was a Puppeteer, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to see more, comment down below. Neji again. He looked older, which was a strange thing if one didn't understand the mechanics of animate ceiling fuinjutsu. He didn't even look thinner from the height he'd gained. The chakra Naruto fed into the scroll every week also kept him healthy. His muscles hadn't even atrophied, thanks to the preservative properties of the ceiling matrix. He looked as though he would wake up at any moment from a refreshing night of sleep. It had been almost a year now. Naruto would be lying if he said he didn't know why he had kept Neji alive. It would have been a great deal easier to simply dispose of the scroll somewhere and sell the lie completely. But then, it would have been simpler to do that for Hanabi too. Just as it would have been simpler to preserve her body in a similar manner instead of putting up with her day in and day out. But then, sealing Neji had been easy. He had been full of indignation over his fight with Hinata and excitement over his plan coming together. That seemed so petty now. He glanced down again, looking at the older teen's closed eyes. The Byakugan, such a powerful tool. Most, when pressed, would have admitted the Sharingan as the more valuable and envied Dujutsu. Unsurpassed reflexes, and the ability to copy any jutsu just by seeing it. The perfect tool for a shinobi. But for a puppeteer, 360-degree sight for miles in any direction, unsurpassed coverage, and the ability to manipulate puppets without even coming within a mile of their opponent. That was the true prize. Which begged the question of why he had even waited this long to consider taking them from Neji. The caged bird seal posed a problem, true, but he had been studying that as a side project for as long as his plan had been in motion. While he couldn't remove the thing, he was certain he could trick it and disable its ability to destroy the eyes upon removal. All it would take would be connecting that part of the matrix to a defunct tag, letting that be destroyed instead of the Byakugan. He had worked that out months ago. Concealment was also an issue. He could hardly explain away the fact that his eyes had suddenly changed color, especially with how recognizable the pale eyes of the Hyuga were. But then, he used contacts on infiltration missions all the time, often for days straight. Ninja contacts were far above their civilian counterparts. They required a small, constant stream of chakra to use, but there was no discomfort or irritation, and their color could be changed on a whim. Similarly, Naruto now habitually wore his large tinted goggles down on missions. It wouldn't be much of a stretch to start wearing them constantly. There were certainly ninja with stranger quirks in the village, although it would probably only exacerbate some of the comparisons people made between him and the Aburame. Other Hyuga might notice something was different, but a simple seal, courtesy of the Nadaime Hokage, on the side of the goggles would fix that. A lot of the more sensitive buildings in the village were covered with them to prevent prying eyes. It would be a hassle, and another constant source of anxiety over being found out, but he had enough of those already. One of them was currently staring at him coldly from across the room. He had expected protests, arguments, screaming, or perhaps even being attacked when he unsealed Neji's body. Instead, Hanabi had simply sat down in the corner of the room and just stared. It wasn't particularly intimidating. Naruto had fully recovered from his brush with a painful death and couldn't feel threatened by the diminutive Hyuga. It was just there. It seemed he wasn't the only one who had been anticipating this day. She confirmed it when she said, "This will be it, you know." He glanced up, but she wasn't looking at him anymore, she was looking at Neji. "I had tutors growing up, but I suppose you suspected as much," she continued, talking more to herself than to him. "I wasn't supposed Tom but got a lot of things I wasn't supposed to, thanks to Hinata. Her weakness was my hope, for the longest time. Hope that maybe I wouldn't have to be branded with that seal. Hope that I wouldn't suffer the cruel fate of my uncle." She smiled wistfully. "I don't think I ever worked out if Hinata was trying to protect me, if it was all an act to make my father more indecisive, or if she really was just that weak." Naruto said nothing, thinking about those few glimpses he'd had of the Hyuga heir when she didn't know he was there. Of the quiet furiosity she had displayed against the various training posts she swiftly reduced to splinters. He wasn't entirely sure himself. "So, I had tutors. Only the best for the potential heir of the clan. They didn't just teach me to fight either. They taught me about what it meant to be a Hyuga, to be a kunoichi. Reading your books, I see now how heavily skewed it was. Such a safe, black and white world they were trying to put me into. But there was one, Akane. She thought I should know what the real world was like. A soft sigh escaped her lips. She didn't last long before my father realized she was straying from the approved lessons. She finally looked around at him, her eyes oddly blank, as though she was reserving her emotions. I was young. I mostly just remember how naughty it felt to be sneaking around behind my father's back like that. But one lesson really stuck out to me. She told me, Hanabi, if you're to be the leader of this clan one day, then you have to know one very important thing. Shinobi make difficult decisions in the name of all sorts of things. As clan leader, you will have to make more than most. What matters though, is that you recognize when a decision will be one step too far. You'll always know it when you see it. It will be the one that makes you feel like you lose no matter which choice you make. Her gaze drifted back to Neji's prone form. I don't think you're a bad person. Despite what I said, I don't think I would have saved you if I did. I don't think I understand you either. Not completely. But I think this is your line. I know what you're thinking about doing, and if you do it, you really will be irredeemable. She quietened, stood, and walked to the door, pausing at the threshold as if wanting to say something else, only to think better of it and continue through without a sound. Naruto had to stop his hand from tapping restlessly against the table. He considered what she said before dismissing it. Where did she get off, lecturing him about morality and where the line was? She didn't know what he'd been through. She couldn't even see the line. He was a shinobi, a killer, someone who did whatever he had to do. So why did he have to do this? He shook his head of the thought. It was obvious, wasn't it? Sasori proved just how weak he really was. He skirted death that day and he needed every advantage he could grab if he wanted to avoid doing so again. He didn't think he was particularly afraid of death. It was something you made peace with eventually in his profession. Still, he didn't want to die yet. There was a lot more he wanted to do. There was a lot more he wanted to know. How far could he push his craft? What could the Kyuubi's chakra do for him? Would people ever recognize him for who he was, instead of what he contained? No, he wasn't dying yet. The Byakugan was just another advantage. A tool. He had plenty of those, so how would one more push him over the line? Besides, Neji was a lost cause anyway. Before Naruto captured him, the teen had been walking across the thinnest ice imaginable. Did people think there would be not consequences for what he did to Hinata? It was only the public nature of the incident that prevented the Hyuga from killing him on the spot. No, the clan had been biding their time, waiting for the right opportunity to remove him. It had been a long time coming anyway. His very existence was a slight to the status quo. Such a prodigal branch member only stirred up the already simmering resentment from that side of the family. What he did to Hinata was simply the last straw. The elders of the clan finally had their justification. If anything, Naruto had prolonged the teen's life. In a way, he would even be freed from the caged bird seal. It's what Sasori would do. That brought his train of thought to a screeching halt. It was what Sasori would do, wasn't it? Except, he had met Sasori, only to find the man painfully lacking. The idealized vision he had, a prodigal puppeteer, misunderstood by his village, going off alone to strike his own path, was irrevocably shattered by that confrontation. But there was something to learn from it too. He had to make his own path, as he had done all those years ago. He had to be the kind of puppeteer he wanted to be, not just some pale imitation of some fantasy ideal from his childish imagination. This is what Sasori would do. But was it something he wanted to do? He was broken from his thoughts by the buzz of his perimeter seal, informing him somebody was at the door. No doubt a mission request, he had been getting more than a few of those since rising to Junin. He gave one last look at Neji's body before sealing it back up and walking out. On the way, he passed Hanabi. She refused to meet his gaze, quietly going through one of her family's kata. It caused something to twist in his stomach, making him scowl. He put the whole thing out of his mind for now. Something to think on when he didn't have a mission. He wasn't happy to be back in the blistering heat of Kaze's great desert. Even less happy to be there on Suna's behest. The village was scrambling to make up for their puppet corps, egregious and insubordinate actions, outside of official sanction. He had to scoff at the thought. He was certain that the only egregious action in their eyes was the fact that they had failed. Still, he wasn't worried about betrayal in this case. Suna was already walking a tightrope here. One more indiscretion like that and the Hokage wouldn't hesitate to retaliate in full. The Kumo situation was just beginning to stabilize, so he would have no qualms turning the full might of Konoha's military on the tenuous ally. A kind man the Sandaime may be, but a leader okay with being seen as weak, he was not. How much farther? Sasuke called out over the wind, somewhere to his right. The sandstorm they were trudging through made it difficult to tell. About 300 feet. Hinata called back, the only one of them with any kind of visibility. The mission was a fairly simple one, the kind a desperate village would throw at him to claw back any kind of credibility. Capturing a nuke nin that had been taking advantage of the war to cause troubles all around the country. The tenuous link they had used to bring Naruto into it was the fact he was a puppeteer. Some guy called Mikade. Naruto had never heard of him, so he wasn't exactly in the upper echelons of the puppet court before he absconded from the village. Naruto might not have even accepted, if the man hadn't also plundered the Chiyo's personal library, taking off with many of her personal techniques. Chiyo was a legend right up there with Chikamatsu Monzaemon himself. The chance to take a look at her notes was well worth a trek through the desert. Although, as he spat out what felt like a small bucketful of sand, he was already regretting not bringing a rebreather of some sort. As it was, he was glad for his goggles. Watch out! Hinata called out. Both Sasuke and Naruto both dropped to the floor just as something whizzed over their heads. Sasuke was back on his feet in an instant, large ornate blade in hand. A chakra blade, useful for cutting through immaterial techniques like chakra strings. It seemed a bit of a cheap tactic in Naruto's opinion. Sasuke had looked at him, particularly smug, when the team had been handed them. Naruto had just idly thumbed his Junin flak jacket in return. He rolled to his feet, flexing his hands to ready himself. The next time something flew at him it met a nasty surprise in the form of Ramia bursting up out of the sand. Her powerful tail met it full on, crushing the flimsier wooden construct into the ground. The sand cushioned the blow, but only until Ramia turned her tail on it again. She released a tight blast of sand, slicing the other puppet right down the middle. The converted water cannon might have been a little less powerful this way, but he wouldn't exactly be lacking ammunition. He moved further forward, beginning to spot the looming silhouettes of the great towers that used to comprise Roran. A relic of a city, destroyed some 20 years earlier, probably related to the Third Shinobi War that was winding down at the time. Right now, Naruto was less interested in the history than he was in the cover the towers represented. As if to prove his suspicions, another puppet whizzed around a fallen building. He got a better look at it this time, bug-eyed, bulbous, and vaguely insectoid. No wonder the man had left the puppet corp if he was creating ugly things like these. That was fine. Naruto set his stance, smirking as he raised a hand. He had a technique he had been waiting to try on a puppet ever since his fight with Sasori. He didn't get the chance, Hinata beat him to it. It was impressive how seamlessly she utilized the chakra blade in the place of her hands, systematically going for the points on the puppets connected to the strings. The construct fell in a useless pile of wrecked parts. Hinata turned, giving him a small smile before her eyes widened ever so slightly. That was all the cue he needed. His fingers danced and Ramia span, her fingers unlatching and extending out into their prehensile cables. The spin took them in a wide circle, shearing right through the puppet that had been sneaking up on him. It was neatly severed into 9 slivers before it got within 10 feet of the blonde. It never would have been able to sneak up on him at all if he had, no, not the time. He gave a thankful smile at Hinata, easily slipping into old habits around the girl. He was rather happy to see she simply took it in stride, giving a professional nod in return. He couldn't see how her cheeks colored through the sand. If you two are done flirting, Sasuke muttered as he ran past, only exacerbating the issue. The strings led this way. The three raced through the ruins, wary for another ambush, but it appeared Mikade had either run out of puppets, or didn't think it worth fighting them. His reason for coming to Roran was unknown, but the Sandaime suspected it had something to do with an old source of sealed chakra held somewhere in the ruins. What the man would do with it was unclear. It was probably for the best he didn't all the same. Usually these great and ancient powers were sealed for a reason. They tracked the rogue puppeteer to an underground passage that eventually opened up into a cavernous chamber. It was an impressive structure, surviving the destruction of the city mostly intact. A thin stone bridge crossed an enormous depression into the earth that stretched down farther than the light could illuminate. It connected to a small island at the center of the whole, where Mikade stood over a very familiar-looking tri-pronged kunai. Stop him! Naruto called to the other two, already sprinting forward. He would be the only one who understood what that innocuous kunai represented. There were few people that the blonde implicitly respected, the Yondaime Hokage was one of them. If the seal master of the last few decades had decided this power needed to be locked away, then it did. Removing the kunai now. You're too late, Konoha Nin. Soon the power of the Ryomuku will be mine, and I'll be truly unstoppable. The thin, emaciated man with wild brown hair reached down and grasped the kunai. Immediately, the seal matrix surrounding it began to twist and writhe, peeling off the floor as the individual kanji slithered up onto the man's body. In moments, his skin had been turned into a tapestry of ink, glowing with unrestrained power. Something at his feet opened up as the kunai was finally pulled free, a blinding light filling the room. It was no flash though, the wall of pure energy only seemed to expand, racing towards Naruto even as the blonde began to turn. It was too fast. He was swallowed in an instant, surrounded on all sides by burning white light. Something brushed his hand and a distant voice called his name before, nothing. Damp grass and a girl, singing. It was a curious thing to wake up to considering where he had just been. Speaking of which, where was he? He opened his eyes and found himself looking up at a large cavern roof, but not the one they had found Mikade in. Round glass skylights broke up the weathered rock, and when he glanced around he found himself surrounded by thick, curving stalagmites, like big rocky teeth. It was like someone had transposed a forest clearing deep underground, complete with flowers and butterflies. It was all very fairy tale, and it made Naruto wonder if he was dreaming, or it was some kind of illusion. Of course, he had never had a dream this lucid before, and he had already cycled his chakra 5 times without anything changing, so wherever he was, it was real. Wakitaki taru omoi, Mamarubeki ru no michi yo, the girl continued singing. He looked around and saw it was a girl maybe a little older than himself with long red hair, looped into 2 long bangs brushing her shoulders before falling down her back in a hastily tied ponytail. Shiraha sasu sora wo aogi. Suna, K's, Arabu Tomo. Her song was clearly a lullaby, although not one he recognized, he almost felt bad for interrupting. Excuse me, he called, opting for his usual routine when talking to civilians, sheepish charm, until he better understood his situation. The girl looked up sharply, startled. She took one look at him before jumping down off the stone she had been sitting on and racing towards the door. He jogged after her, curious about the reaction. It wasn't hard to keep up with her considering she clearly didn't know how to use chakra. The moment she passed through an opening in the door though, he paused. 2 shadowy figures waited just down the flight of stairs. The moment the girl passed them they looked up and Naruto was shocked to notice they were puppets. They flew through the air towards him and he hastily raised a hand, but it proved pointless. The moment they tried to cross the threshold into the cavern, some kind of barrier lit up. They fell apart like broken toys, scattering on the ground around his startled form. The moment of hesitation allowed the girl to turn the corner and get away, the portal in front of him closing up with a thick stone door. Now thoroughly confused, he glanced around before looking up at the glass skylights. Shrugging, he quickly ran up the wall, and broke out. The sight that met him was awe-inspiring. Enormous spires rose around him, 3 times taller than any building he had ever seen before. Terraces and footbridges stretched between them, forming a beautiful lattice of stone and metal that seemed to unfurl in every direction like a spider's web. Pipes seemed to stretch everywhere, their soft humming filling the air with a soothing buzz. It was so surprising that he was caught flat-footed for a moment, staring like a yokel. It nearly cost him, as he almost noticed the shadow growing around his feet too late. He dived forward, just about saving his skin as a huge blade cleaved the air where his neck had been. He rolled back to his feet, taking in the sight of yet another puppet. It seemed similar to the style of Mukade's with its bug-eyed, segmented design, and that only raised more questions about just where the hell he was. Still, a fight was a fight. Now that Hinata wasn't here to get in the way, he still had that technique he had been waiting to try out. He lifted a hand, coiling the chakra strings in his palm as his eyes expertly sought out where the puppet was most vulnerable. Soen, Jasu, he whispered, not usually one for calling out the names of his techniques, but this one required a lot of concentration. The chakra strings launched out, visibly glowing for once, and latched onto the puppet as it flew forward. The minute they connected, the construct froze. For a moment, Naruto's mind expanded, filled with the crisscrossing seal designs that compelled the puppet to move. A moment later he picked them apart, overrode them and took over, wresting control away from whoever commanded it. The chakra strings pulsed a bright blue before fading out of sight, the puppet twitching jerkily in the air before stabilizing. Just in time too, as a puppet that could have been its twin descended on them. The blonde simply smirked and twitched his fingers. It was slower than he would have controlled one of his own, but the puppet he had subsumed turned sharply, bladed arm coming around and bisecting its counterpart violently. Well, good to see that works, he said to himself happily, walking over to his new acquisition. I've been wanting to get a look at a genuine Suna construction for years. All of the puppet core members he had tracked down had forced theirs to self-destruct before allowing him to pick them apart. The moment he drew close though, what could only be described as a thick, purple cord of chakra suddenly snapped out from one of the humming pipes, latching onto the puppet he had commandeered. In an instant, Naruto felt connected to something old and powerful, the sheer scale of the entity he brushed was intoxicating. Control of the puppet was almost instantly wrested from him, but in those last few instants, as he was still resisting, he felt the last command sent. He braced himself as the puppet exploded, but it was too close. Time seemed to slow as he was lifted from his feet, instinctively wincing against the brush of flames. Then, abruptly and without transition, he was somewhere else. It took him a moment to regain his bearings from the instantaneous movement and realize there was a hand on his shoulder. Are you all right? He looked up and found a dark, patterned mask staring back at him. Apparently noticing his confusion, the man quickly lifted it up, revealing a handsome, familiar face, framed by spiky blonde bangs. Sorry about that, the man said, gesturing to Naruto's headband. Are you reinforcements? I didn't send for any, and it's not like Sandaime-sama to get paranoid. Your Namikaze Minato, Naruto uttered lamely, unable to pull his thoughts together into anything more coherent. The supposedly dead Hokage gave him a bemused smile. Sorry, have we met? He took a long look at Naruto's face, and the blonde found himself returning the favor, trying to reconcile the dead man in front of him with his supposed new reality. Actually, that's unimportant. As long as you're here, you should head back to Konoha and tell the Hokage we have everything in hand. Naruto's mind was still reeling, and he said the first thing that came to mind. I can't, I have a mission to capture a rogue puppeteer here. He glanced around, wondering just where here actually was. A mix-up at the mission office. Another masked Konoha nin suggested, appearing next to him along with a much larger man in twin body flickers. They could have been any Akamaiki or Aburame clan members under those masks, but seeing Minato take his off, they followed. Naruto's stomach sank further. He recognized their faces. Shibi and Chusa, the clan heads, markedly younger than he ever remembered seeing them. Younger clan heads. The fourth Hokage, back from the dead. The ruins of Roran being replaced by this towering city. Naruto almost wanted to claw at his hair. He had read that space-time fuinjutsu could have wildly unpredictable effects, but time travel. At least 23 years in the past if he had his context clues all correct. That meant the man in front of him wasn't even the Hokage yet. Unlike them to make that kind of mistake, but I suppose it's possible. He realized he had zoned out and quickly refocused. Ramifications to the space-time continuum aside, he still had a mission to do. Then he could see about returning to his own time. He certainly didn't want to do it the long way around. You were assigned the same mission then? He asked, cutting into the banter between the three older ninja, in more sense than one. Who is your target? Chusa looked at him strangely. It was the same look he remembered seeing on Chuji's face when the boy had to decide what to eat. I assumed the same as yours. The rogue puppeteer that showed up here 3 years ago, Anrokuzen. 3 years. Mikade must have been hit by whatever sent him back first, getting him thrown back farther. Would Hinata and Sasuke be affected too? Would they show up here in a few years' time? Another thought for later. He nodded at the larger man, not bothering with the semantics of their target's name. If Anrokuzen wasn't Mikade, then he would just search elsewhere. What leads do you have so far? He asked. They had been assigned this mission, from their perspective at least, first, so they would have had more time to scout this era out. Whoa, calm down. I already said that we have things under control, Minato said, smiling beatifically. Naruto remembered reading about the man's famous charisma. It was strange, experiencing it firsthand. Not to mention how damn familiar the man's face seemed. As your super, he trailed off, noticing the dark green of Naruto's flak jacket. As the first team to respond, I'm recommending you return to Konoha and update the Hokage that we have things under control. Damn war, Chooser grumbled from behind them, having also taken note of the teen's advanced rank. With all due respect, Naruto countered firmly. We both have a mission here. Things can only work smoother if we cooperate. Minato seemed ready to argue, but apparently something he saw in Naruto made him reconsider. All right. We've only been here a few hours ourselves, the extra set of eyes wouldn't hurt. He glanced up at the tallest tower, standing like a beacon in the center of the city. As far as we're able to tell, Anrokuzen has set himself up as the princess's advisor, to what end we're not sure. The Ryomyaku, Naruto guessed, not appreciating the obvious attempt to withhold information from him. Minato only looked a little abashed, shrugging noncommittedly. Most likely. It also likely has to do with the puppet sentinels wandering the place, Naruto continued, still thinking about that powerful energy he had felt. What do you know about those? Shibi asked curiously. I have found the numbers to be incongruously large for the scope of a single puppeteer. Well, Naruto smirked, I am something of an expert in that regard. He raised a hand and made his chakra strings visible for a moment, earning intrigued looks from the others. Instead of commenting on the oddity of his ability, Minato just nodded. We'll leave that aspect to you then. Continue to scout and we'll meet up again in an hour with more information. How will I find you? Naruto asked. The older blonde smiled, passing him one of his famous tri-pronged kunai as he said, it's easier if we find you. He stepped back, resetting his mask and putting an authoritative pressure in his tone. Anything else? Chooser raised his hand, staring at Naruto curiously, but thankfully Minato ignored him. All right, move out. And just like that, they vanished, leaving Naruto on his own again. All of this was a lot to process, and the simple fact of the matter was, he didn't have the time. It was very likely that if there was a way back to his own era, he would have to find it on his own. He felt it was a bad idea to let people know he was from the future, and the longer he stayed, the more chances there were of others finding out. In that vein, he quickly set off towards the center of the city. Even if this Anrokuzen wasn't Mikade, it seemed like the right place to start looking for answers. He arrived at what looked to be a central plaza of some sort, just as a large celebration was getting into swing. A parade was underway, complete with fantastical floats and fireworks. That was fortunate, people were often a lot more pliable when reveling. It would be simple to whip up a disguise and work the crowd for information. The moment he neared the festivities though, his sixth sense began to act up. Something felt incredibly off about the whole thing. Deciding instead to get a better vantage, he quickly skipped up the side of a nearby tower, alighting on an empty balcony that offered the best view. It didn't take him long to realize what was wrong. Naruto, a blessedly familiar voice called out, and he turned, surprised, to see Hinata darted across the wall at him, giving him a relieved smile. Naruto, Hinata cried out. I was so worried when that light hit us, and then I woke up in this place and, she realized she was babbling and paused. Naruto, I think this is Roran. But that's impossible, isn't it? He just stared at her a moment, surprised, before quickly schooling his features. He did that a lot around her. He probably thought she didn't notice, but when you grew up in a compound of people whispering behind your back, you grew accustomed to catching slight changes of expressions. She didn't care, he had a mask, just like everyone else. What mattered was the fact that he endured. She knew about the treatment he had received growing up, she even suspected why, but the fact that he chose to raise a middle finger to everyone who disparaged him and forged on with his dream all the same. That was what inspired her. I hate space-time fuinjutsu, he muttered, glancing down at the crowd. The parade was in full swing and the crowd was cheering uproariously. It seems we've been sent back in time, about 2 decades. She nodded, having worked out as much herself, ironically, from the out-of-date fashions she recognized in the people of the city. And people had told her those kunoichi classes in the academy were useless. That's not all. The people, there, she trailed off when she noted his grim expression, still staring down at the crowd. I know, he said. With her Byakugan active, as it had been since she woke up in this strange place, it was all too obvious that the crowd below was entirely fake, just a bunch of puppets going through the motions of celebration. It's the pipes, she told him. To her eyes, they were blinding streaks of purple light, crisscrossing her vision like a glowing spider's web. The energy in them is feeding the puppets. I've never seen this much chakra before. It's the Ryamyaku, Naruto guessed, still examining the crowd. It was the only way a puppeteer could even dream of controlling this many puppets. On his own, even taking into account the simplified actions of the crowd, and using every tenketsu on his body at once, he still wouldn't be able to replicate a quarter of this. It was a galling thought. Then Mikade is here as well. He arrived earlier, apparently going by Anrokuzen now. Hinata nodded, she had heard that name while she searched the city. He had sounded important. Sasuke? Naruto asked, only receiving a sad shake of the head. I haven't seen him. He was much further back in the room. He might not have been hit. Naruto clicked his teeth irritably. The one time he would have liked to have a set of Sharingan on hand. Sasuke's attention to detail could have been useful here. He quickly caught Hinata up on what he had seen so far, including the puppet sentinels and his meeting with the other Konoha team. As the two were discussing what to do next, the fake crowd surged with cheers, drawing their attention up to a high balcony on the tallest tower in the city. That must be the princess, Hinata said, squinting slightly to focus her Byakugan. Lacking her visual prowess, Naruto settled for scanning the crowd again, looking for any clues in the puppet crowd that might tell him something about the kind of puppeteer Mikade was. 3 years was a long time to train, so if he was Anrokuzen, there was no telling how much more capable he had become. Because he was looking away, he was caught off guard when Hinata suddenly leapt from the balcony. He turned just in time to spot her catching a figure falling through the air. He cursed under his breath. They had just been discussing how much of an impact they could have on history if they weren't careful. Muttering under his breath about soft-hearted girls, he took off after her, catching up just as she was setting the other girl down. He simultaneously realized it was both the princess, and the girl he had seen earlier in the underground cavern. You. They both said at the same time. Why did you run? What do you want with me? They said, again speaking over one another. Narrowing his eyes, Naruto spoke quicker. Maybe you shouldn't be concerned with us, when apparently somebody is trying to kill you. The young teen just sneered at him. Don't be ridiculous, she said, before pointedly looking at Hinata. I'm very glad for your help, but I'm sure it was just an accident. Hinata quickly shook her head, having been quite bewildered by the hostile confrontation. No, I saw it quite clearly. The man behind you on the balcony pushed you. The girl seemed quite ready to dismiss Naruto, but Hinata's comment caught her off guard. Anrokuzen. That's absurd, he's my advisor. Has been since my mother died. He would never do anything to hurt me. It didn't take much for Naruto to put the pieces together. A young princess, guardian of an enormous power in the form of the Ryamyaku, a dead queen, a new advisor. Let me guess, he drawled. This Anrokuzen showed up, out of the blue, 3 years ago. Then, not long after, your mother died, leaving him as your sole caretaker. He thought it was obvious enough a child would be able to see it, but sentimentality could skew rationale something terrible. You watch what you're implying, the young princess hissed back at him. I won't hear any more of this slander. She began walking away. I shall ask Anrokuzen myself if there's any basis behind these wild allegations. Yes, because the regicide advocate is just going to come out and say, yes, I did it, isn't he? Naruto drawled as he and Hinata took off after her. The Hyuga merely gave him a tired look before hurrying after the princess. We really advise that you stay with us, princess. We think Anrokuzen might be a missing nin we're tracking that used to go by the name Mikade. Impossible, the girl shot back, apparently just as dismissive of Hinata now. Anrokuzen wouldn't happen to be a puppeteer, would he? Naruto questioned with a roll of his eyes, almost laughing at how the girl froze. What does that have to do with anything? Before either of them could answer, all three were blindsided when a side door burst open. A woman in concealing clothes dashed out, swept up the princess, and took off. It was only the suddenness of it all that allowed her to gain even a little distance on the two shinobi, as it was painfully obvious she was no ninja herself, despite the cliched attire. Using chakra, the two Konoha nin caught her all too easily, Hinata grabbing the princess from her shoulder and Naruto tackling her to the floor, holding a kunai to her throat. Who are you, and why are you going after the princess? He asked brusquely, in a cold, emotionless tone that he preferred for the few interrogations he had presided over. Warrant. A new voice called, as yet another strangely garbed woman burst from the room the would-be captor had been heading towards. Don't hurt her. This one was decidedly chunkier, with a large, prominent snaggletooth and wide, weepy eyes. Definitely not shinobi then. No ninja he had seen could so convincingly pull off the out-of-the-depth civilian this well. The newcomer was followed by a small group of hesitant, nervous women, all in that same, ridiculous fake ninja getup. He glanced down at the woman he was holding, noting the fact that she was quivering quite violently, before shooting a questioning glance at Hinata. The Hyuga could only shrug, befuddled. Rolling his eyes, he released the woman. She scrambled away from him, holding her throat. He might have been a tad overzealous with the kunai there, because a thin trail of red was leaking from between her fingers. Come here, he beckoned with a sigh. When the woman didn't move he sighed and stepped closer faster than she could backpedal. Before she could even gasp in shock he had pulled her hand away from her throat, coated his hand in warm, green chakra and held it up to the wound. What are you? She paused as she felt the sting of the cut fade. When Naruto took his hand away there was just clean, unbroken skin, only marred by a little splash of blood. He offered her a small cloth for that as well. Oh, thank you. There was a long, awkward pause amongst the mixed crowd, tension hanging in the air like thick soup. At least until Hinata bopped Naruto on the back of the head lightly. You could have been a bit politer, Naruto-kun. Naruto could have said a lot to that, starting with when Hinata had grown so bold with him, but decided to stay quiet for now. The little vaudeville display had effectively eased the tension, enough that when Hinata turned to face the motley bunch, they didn't immediately flinch from her. Now, I think a round of explanations is in order, don't you think? In the end, it turned out to be far from any grand conspiracy. They were just desperate women, hoping for some answers from their apparently absent and aloof princess. Sarah, as the two Konoha nin learned her name was, denied this, but the evidence was damning. Over time, more and more of the city's men had been taken from their homes, from their families, to work as slaves beneath the city, pumping out Anrokuzen's army of production line puppets. When Sarah, previously a symbol of hope and joy for her people, had been seen to do nothing, authorizing it even, the remaining women had grown desperate. But it was clear that this was no trained militia. They were just people, hopelessly out of the depths. If they were to try and seriously fight back against Anrokuzen, they would be slaughtered. I can't believe this, Sarah denied furiously. How can you say my people are being stolen? Did you not see that crowd out there? Puppets, Naruto supplied, earning a cold look. Yes, you would say that. How do I know this is not some ploy of yours to steal me away and hold me for ransom? He was about to tell her that if he wanted to kidnap her, she would have never seen him coming but, apparently anticipating this, Hinata placed a hand on his arm. It's true, princess, the entire crowd is just an illusion. You need only step outside and see for yourself. Fine. The girl shot back hotly, tramping outside towards the still reveling crowd. That alone should have been warning enough, considering the fact she had supposedly just been seen falling to her death not moments ago. Still, she didn't even have to walk that far. She only had to look at that same balcony, where she apparently still stood, waving woodenly back at the celebrating crowd. Impossible, she muttered numbly. Huh, now you're a real puppet princess, Naruto commented dryly, earning a slap on the arm from his companion. Not helping Naruto-kun, Hinata chided, giving Sarah a sad look. Indeed, it looked as though the girl was going through a small mental breakdown. Is that what we're doing? Naruto shot back. What do you mean? Hinata asked, eyes widening. We have to help these people, Naruto. We have to find Mikade, and get back to our own time. Everything else is irrelevant. But, the people here, she said, voice quiet under his intense look. Hinata, remember where we come from. In a few years this city will be ruins, slowly being reclaimed by the desert. How do you think that happens? We can't just go around meddling with the past. There are consequences for that kind of thing. Who knows what we could accidentally change? He gestured to the small group of women. These people, whatever happens to them has already happened. Hinata looked down, uncertain. However, she surprised him by stepping back, looking up at him with her brow furrowed. How could you say something so cold? She looked at the women, moving to console their shocked princess. We're partially responsible for all this. We didn't stop Mikade. We need to help them. It wasn't a request, and Naruto was genuinely surprised to see her standing up to him. You're going to, whether I say yes or not, aren't you? Hinata nodded and he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'd like to go on record as saying this is a terrible idea with potentially catastrophic ramifications. But sure, let's help save Roran, or whatever. He wheezed when Hinata rocketed forward, wrapping him in a hug out of nowhere and nearly knocking the wind out of him. I knew you wouldn't abandon them. Naruto had to bite his tongue to prevent the usual quippy retort of, then you clearly don't know me all that well. It would have been counterproductive at this point. Hinata backed off as Sarah approached, turning away to hide the violent red of her cheeks. I still can't quite believe that Mikade would do all of this. She seemed to take a moment to compose herself. But if what these women says is true, we need to stop him. Funny, Naruto muttered, sending a glance Hinata's way. The girl was purposefully ignoring him, going over to question the women that were now standing around uncertainly. We had just decided something similar. Then how do we proceed? Sarah asked, and upon seeing Naruto's raised eyebrow, clarified with a small blush. You are the shinobi. And, despite our rough introduction, your friend did save my life. We need to confront Mikade, he said. It's the fastest way to end all of this. The mission at least. He still had no idea how they were getting home. Sarah frowned. I'm not sure that will work. And, Mikade is very well protected by his puppet legions. To get to him, we would have to first get past them. Army of puppets. Sounds fun, he drawled, only half sarcastic. It might not come to that, she said thoughtfully, thinking on her feet. Now that I'm aware of the situation, it becomes rather clear that Mikade has been tapping into the power of the Ryumyaku. If we can simply cut off that connection, he should be greatly weakened. And how would we do that? The red-haired girl smiled. My family have been custodians of the Ryumyaku for generations. I alone have the power to shut off the flow of energy at the source. Naruto thought back to the sealing matrix in that cavernous room that had started all of this. More specifically, the tri-pronged kunai acting as the seal's anchor. His hand instinctively sought out the one in his pocket. It couldn't be that simple. Sounds good, Hinata agreed as she joined them. But what do we do about? He gestured to the group of women, still standing about lamely. The nearest access point for the Ryumyaku is in the underworks. Sarah supplied, brow creasing again. If Mikade has my people anywhere, it will be there. We can cut off his power and free them in one swoop. Then what are standing around for? Hinata said brightly. Let's go free your people. The statement was punctuated by a rallying cry from the gaggle of women and the whole group took off in the direction Sarah led. Naruto dropped back to jog alongside Hinata, this pace was nothing for them. You're enjoying this, aren't you? His only answer was an impudent smile as Hinata increased her pace slightly to run alongside the princess. Despite himself, Naruto couldn't keep from cracking a small smirk himself. The pipe system interconnecting Roran was fascinating. Naruto had plenty of time to examine it as they moved through the city. The most curious thing was the fact that they were actually pipes. Chakra conductive materials existed, but he had never heard of pure chakra being piped anywhere before. It made him wonder at the mechanics of the engineering marvel. The sheer volume was mind-boggling too. If what the citizens said was true, Mukad's puppets were semi-autonomous, able to make limited decision in combat without the man's direct input. It made sense. Trying to control that many puppets wasn't just an issue of power, but focus. Manipulating hundreds of independent puppets at once just wasn't feasible without pre-programming certain responses. He had tried it before and, while complex, the seal work wasn't unmanageable. He simply preferred the more personal touch in his work. Still, now that he had cracked chakra wires, new possibilities were certainly opening up. He wondered how Mikade had managed to circumvent the problem. He didn't realize how quickly he would be getting his answers. The small group descended what looked like a service ladder into a cramped, underground space filled with large pipes and indefinable machinery. It was only when Sarah guided them further in, showing a remarkable knowledge of her city's underbelly for a pampered princess, that they found what they were looking for. Naruto suspected that their initial meeting wasn't the first time Sarah had snuck away to be by herself. The space quickly opened out, becoming surprisingly spacious. But then, it had to be, to accommodate all of the prisoners. Teams of them, possibly 100, working raggedly at the various machinery. Naruto could see how it worked now. Enormous man cranks created huge pressure differentials, guiding the energy up and into increasingly thinner tubes, keeping the chakra potent all the way up to the highest towers. It was no wonder the people of Roran had managed such technological and engineering marvels with a source of power like this. There was also the small problem of the guards, and before Naruto could stop them, one of the women they had brought along cried out, spotting her husband among the ragged masses. That was enough. Instantly, all of the puppets, perhaps a dozen in total, turned to them. Blank, bug-eyed faces stared for a second as a stillness overcame the space. Even the men had stopped their labor to look at the new arrivals, hope welling up in the tired eyes. Then things started to move again. Acting on instinct, Naruto threw out 2 scrolls, unsealing Ramia and Arakun at the same time. Hinata pivoted, quickly directing Sarah and the civilians away from the fight. Naruto barely noticed as he finally let himself loose. Ramia moved forward before any of the puppets could approach, her tail flicking out with precision. A fine beam of sand split 3 puppets in half. The rest jinked to the side, flying forward on that undeterminable lift all sooner puppets had. One suddenly found its arm bound by a thick cord of fast-drying adhesive, connected on the other end to a far wall. Its own momentum forced it into a sudden curve, slamming one of its companions hard enough to crack the wood. Shaken and damaged, both made easy prey for Ramia, diving forward and tearing into them until there was nothing salvageable left. Sensing Naruto had left himself defenseless, the other 7 charged forward even faster. One was caught in webbing as Arakun re-emerged from the shadows, but the others made it through. Arakun abruptly went limp and Naruto shot out a hand. Suddenly, one theirs was no longer friendly. It spun, arm falling away to reveal a collapsible buzzsaw. Taken by surprise, 2 more were reduced to kindling in an instant. With a twitch of his fingers, the one he had taken control of exploded outwards in a brilliant fireball, taking the 11th out with it. The last didn't even get to see what Naruto had in store for it, going limp and falling apart before it got close. The blonde blinked, glancing at the chakra blade vibrating in the wall, then back at Hinata. He wasn't sure who was more surprised. All of it happened in less than 10 seconds, leaving the civilians stunned. Thankfully, Sarah rallied faster than most. Come on, she called, leading the women down to the prisoners. They began systematically freeing them off their bonds while Hinata and Naruto kept a wary out for reinforcements. Suspecting this would take some time, Naruto moved over to one of the assembly lines. Various interchangeable puppet parts were sitting on a conveyor belt, just waiting to be assembled by the now absent workforce. The sight caused him to scowl. Reducing art to industry, he grumbled. Where was the finesse, the creativity, in this? That was very impressive, Naruto-kun, Hinata said, resheathing her chakra blade as she walked up to him. All this time, and aside from our sparring, I've never properly seen you in action. There was still a hint of rose on her cheeks that she couldn't quite stamp out. Seeing Naruto in motion, the intensity and the artfulness of his puppet's movements. It was breathtaking. Oh, thanks, he muttered absently, crouching down to get a better look at one of the disembodied torsos. It was a very utilitarian design, all ease of construction, no grace. What are you looking for? Something, he said, extending a hand and probing the puppet with chakra strings, that has eluded me for, aha. He stood, triumphant, realization glittering in his eyes. It's the wood. What? Hinata asked, shocked by the sudden exclamation. The wood, he repeated. How sooner gets the puppets to fly? I thought it was some elaborate seal matrix, tried some myself even, but the puppets were always too heavy. This wood is extremely light, porous but tough. It must be from some special grove in K's. Likely along the coastal regions where the most arable land was. Like the wood he used, it too seemed to have some unique, chakra-conducting properties. Oh, Hinata said, confused, but Naruto was too deep in his own thoughts to notice. Realizing that, he frowned. It wouldn't be too hard to import and use the wood himself, but he had grown attached to the Konoha lumber he used. It was sturdy, and naturally reinforced. Similarly, the resin he used to strengthen and treat his puppets would counteract the utility of the porous case wood. The Sunanin must have some way of counteracting that fragility he didn't know about. Secrets inside of secrets, it seemed. Although, now he was at least on the right track. Maybe those plans he had for flying puppets weren't so impossible after all. He was so caught up in his musing, he didn't notice when the puppet torso he had been examining shook slightly. He did notice when it exploded outwards in massive conflagration that would have easily consumed him, if he wasn't abruptly 30 feet away. You need to be a bit more careful when surrounded by potential weapons, the future Yondaime chided with a teasing smile. You remind me of Kushina. She's always going off into her little daydreams too. The man frowned slightly, peering at Naruto's face a little more intently. You kind of look like her too. What did you say your last name was? Thankfully, Naruto was freed from answering by a slow clap. Brilliant. All of my would-be opponents lined up so neatly. You've made this all just too easy. Mikade had changed a lot in 3 years. Gone was the pale, emaciated man with wild hair and a crazed look in his eye. Instead, there stood a well-fed, ornately dressed noble with styled hair and a confident smirk. Although, his eyes were still crazed. It seemed there was no fixing that. Anrokuzen, please, this is your last chance to end all of this. Sarah called, standing in front of the ragged group of liberated slaves as though her body would actually provide them any protection. Mikade merely sneered at her. Ah, Haim-sama, I suppose it was just too much to ask for you to accept your final role in all of this and just die. Still, you are correct. This will be where everything ends. He raised a hand and, instead of connecting to any of the puppet parts lying around, shot his chakra strings into one of the many pipes running through the underworks. Hundreds of barely visible purple threads crisscrossed the room, connecting to the countless inactive puppets just lying around. They seemed to pull themselves together, as if stitched by some great invisible hand. Mikade had instantly generated himself an army, and proceeded to immediately point it at the gathered civilians. It seems my workforce has also outlived the usefulness, the man stated with a cold smile, moving his hand slightly. The moment he did, the entire puppet horde turned their attentions on the recently freed prisoners, charging forward. Buban Baika no Jutsu. An enormous hand suddenly expanded into the room, nearly filling the limited space. With a simple sweep, it caught more than half of the entire army, flipping over and brutally crushing it into the ground. Haijutsu, Taiju Mushidama, a more even voice called, and the puppets that hadn't been crushed in Chuse's palm stopped midair, shuddering violently. One by one they began to fall apart, hundreds upon thousands of bugs crawling out of their bodies. Naruto made a mental note to bug-proof his puppets in the future, before turning his sights on Mikade. The man seemed nonplussed by the eradication of his puppet army. It quickly became obvious why when he extended his hand and connected to the pipes again. He simply intended to do it again. The modular design of his puppets became clearer. Unless completely crushed, and the individual parts destroyed, somebody with his power could simply pull them back together. Naruto didn't intend to let him, bringing Ramia around and activating her sand cannon before she even finished turning. Mikade was forced to grab puppets closer to him, bringing them around as a hasty shield. The sand gouged a rough line through their bodies, but didn't hit the puppeteer. The distraction was enough though. Minato appeared behind the man in a yellow flash, a shrieking orb of pure energy held above his palm. It was like no technique Naruto had ever seen before, pure, concentrated chakra manipulation, turned into a vicious close-range attack. It slammed into Mukud's back and threw the man forward, violently digging a crater out of his spine. All of the puppets he had been reassembling fell apart, the sound of skittering wood filling the air for a moment before everything went quiet. Is it over? Sarah asked quietly, only to freeze as Mikade gasped, pulling himself to his knees. Before their eyes, the damage Minato's technique had done healed away, the inside of his body revealed to be some composite wood. You fools, he growled. Don't you understand? Here, in this place, I am immortal. Hinata ran over to Sarah's side, shaking the girl from her stupefied daze. You said you could turn off the Ryumyaku. The princess nodded dumbly, still shocked by the sight of her longtime advisor recovering from a mortal wound. Then we need to do that now. He's using its power to heal himself. Finally having something concrete to hold onto, Sarah nodded quickly, allowing herself to be pulled along behind the Hyuga. But what about my people? They'll take care of them. Hinata shot back over her shoulder, pointing to where Shibi and Chuzu were leading the panicking civilians off in another direction. Deciding to continue putting her trust in these shinobi, the princess nodded resolutely and picked up her pace. That left Minato and Naruto facing down Mikade, who, by now, had managed to completely heal himself. He glanced after the fleeing civilians before disregarding them, instead tuning his sights on escaping the princess. He moved to give chase, only to find Minato in front of him again, spinning orb of chakra primed. He was sent flying back for a second time, but it confirmed that conventional attacks would do little in the way of putting the man down for good. Any experience with enemies you can't kill? Minato asked conversationally, reappearing next to Naruto. No, but I do have some with puppeteers obsessed with immortality, curiously enough. He wasn't sure what it was about the situation that caused him to be so quippy. Minato's calm self-assuredness, despite the odds, seemed infectious. Suppose that'll have to do. How'd you put that one down? Naruto's features twisted. I didn't. Well, Minato said, thrown for the moment. First time for everything. The rubble Mikade had been thrown into shifted, revealing something a lot uglier coming out than the one that had gone in. Far from just turning himself into some self-healing puppet, Mikade had apparently been a bit overzealous with his modifications. He now appeared to be some large, insectoid thing. Complete with huge bug eyes, a long, segmented body and vicious pincers, practically dripping with poison. We had better hope so. It was easy enough to find the nearest source of the Ryomyaku, easier still to close it. Her mother had often sent her to sleep with stories of the sleeping dragon, whose bones rested beneath their city. The ability to feel out and close off that power was as natural to her as breathing. It would have been simplicity itself to reach out and grasp it, to pull that great power into her body, but her mother's warning won out. That was a power that consumed, she had said. If Sarah took in that energy, she would never be able to release it, and it would burn her from the inside. No, now she had the shinobi. Now she had people she could trust to end this nightmare. This was her part. The floor shook as a body slammed into a nearby wall. A man slowly peeled himself out of the impression he had made in the concrete, grimacing until he caught sight of the two of them. Haim-sama, if you could hurry up with closing off the Ryomyaku. Minato asked. His tone was lightly joking, but there was something far more serious in his eyes. I don't understand. I should have closed off his immediate connection. She glanced down at the eye sigil on the floor, definitely closed. Unless, he's tapping into the source. Her mother had only ever taken her down there once. Well, if you could. The future Hokage was cut off abruptly as something big and ugly crashed its way into the room, flailing with segmented wooden arms at the two puppets harassing it. For all the damage Naruto could do with Ramia and Arakun, Mikade could heal just as fast. It was all he could do not to get squished by one of those dozen arms himself. Hinata, he called, and Sarah only realized she had been staring, frozen in place, when the kunoichi at her side grabbed her arm and pulled her away, deeper into the underworks. The sounds of fighting continued on behind them, echoing in the cramped space as the princess took over, leading Hinata in the direction they needed to go to reach the heart of the city. Will they be okay? She asked worriedly, between panted breaths. Had she ever run this much in her life? She was surprised by the brilliant smile the pale-eyed girl gave her. You shouldn't underestimate Naruto-kun. Something like this won't even slow him down. Filled with renewed vigor, Sarah found her second wind and managed to push herself faster. She missed the small, worried glance Hinata sent over her shoulder. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.